Hello and welcome back to Global with me, Matthew Amroliwala. No means no. It is a familiar mantra, one drummed into our consciousness by campaigners trying to prevent sexual assault. But California's legislators think it needs to go one step further. Sexual consent is not just the absence of a no, it should actively require both parties to agree. In other words, yes means yes. There are growing worries about US universities. Some figures suggest at least 1 in 5 female students are sexually assaulted. So California is now writing the rule into law, at least on state-funded campuses. Will it actually make a difference? Let's talk about this for the next few minutes, because discussing these issues is the British lawyer Sophia Cannon, and from Lexington in Kentucky, Professor Ann Coker, who's the chair of the Centre for Research on Violence Against Women at the University of Kentucky. Thank you, both of you, for being with us here on Global. Professor, to you, first of all, I read out that statistic. It is a really surprising statistic, 1 in 5. Whatever the solution, there is clearly a very real problem here.
Absolutely a real problem, and it's true across the United States and probably worldwide. So it's not exclusively a problem on college campuses. That's just where the current attention is.
When they talk about a new law which is clear, which is active, which involves consent, what do you think they mean by that particularly?
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that when we talk about consent, it is a very difficult issue. And this particular law expands the definition such that we're talking about not exclusively a requirement that there be more aggressive response to indicate no. And in many situations, it is very difficult to gain consent in that way. But the issue is that we need to start talking about consent and actually having that discussion on college campuses and in other settings.
Yes, because, I mean, invariably this is young people, it involves relationships, sometimes alcohol. I mean, it's historically confusing, it's awkward. Do you think a law like this makes it more confusing or a little clearer?
I think it helps to make it clear, because we're really talking about, and you mentioned alcohol and drugs are huge issues for college campuses and also for individuals off college campuses. So any time that we talk about and make people aware of the problem, we're getting closer to a solution. So certainly the law will increase the awareness, and that's very important, and it increases our understanding of issues of consent. And I also want to say one additional thing, and I have 2 sons, so this is of course personal to me, and of course I've been a college student for some length of time, and that is most men are not violent. And that's an important component to remember. So there are select individuals that we really need to focus a lot of that attention on.
Let me come back to you in a second, but Sophia, we're talking there about America, but this is universal, isn't it?
Indeed. In
this country, there has been new advice for prosecutors all around this area of consent, hasn't there?
Indeed. Well, first of all, Section 74 of the Sexual Offences Act actually compresses the idea of what is consent, and it defines what it is. The problem is, at the moment, it's put in such a way that a prosecutor has to go behind the idea of whether the defendant themselves understood what consent meant. So, for example, we have 2 individuals in a student room. The female is drunk. She may have consented earlier, but does she consent now she's drunk? Is there an idea of rolling consent? Is there an idea of the fact that, well, she said it earlier, or we were boyfriend and girlfriend, or she hit on me? It's that idea of the whole nebulous of consent needs to be addressed, as the professor says.
Is something like this enforceable, do you think?
It certainly is, because what we've got for the first time, especially in California, is the whole idea of turning consent on its head. Sex now is not just about procreation, it's recreation. So these youngsters have to now say, this is what I want, and this is how I want it doing to me, rather than no to a particular act.
Professor, I can see you nodding there. I was asking about enforceability. It was interesting because the consent can be non-verbal if it's unambiguous. Now, even as I say that out loud, you can see the obvious difficulties or potential difficulties.
That is correct. That is correct. I think that what we are trying to do at the University of Kentucky and in other college campuses, and I should say, there are really many people who are very interested in the prevention angle of this, and I want to say one of the questions that was raised in electronically to me was, will this help? Will this law help in terms of reducing sexual violence on college campuses? Anytime you talk about the issue of consent, that's an element that needs to be in the mix. And I think that's a very important component. We have bystander intervention programs that do show great efficacy. Whether we can really confirm from what source we see the prevention is an entirely different evaluation question. But I see a lot of hope.
I'm slightly running out of time, so just a couple of questions to you, first of all, because one campaigner was saying in America that the pervasive idea there is that if it's not super violent, it somehow doesn't count as a sexual assault. Is that the prevailing view?
Well, that's the problem with our definitions. We think of sexual assault as specifically rape. Most sexual assault is actually associated with a drug or alcohol and being too drunk or high to give consent. That's the 1 in 20 figures that you provided earlier. I want to say also 8% of young men report these behaviors as well, or experiencing these behaviors. So it does affect both men and women.
Sophia, a quick final thought, because it's interesting. We talked about whether it's helpful for students. Perhaps it's also helpful for institutions, because certainly in America, a lot of institutions, universities, criticised for not reacting properly when these things are reported. Do you think that is perhaps a reason to do it as well, in terms of what the institutions should be looking out for? And would you like to see a similar thing here?
Certainly, definitely. We need this. We need this law here, because it's education with legislation. The legislation is not going to work unless our young men are educated what consent is. And like the professor, I'm a mother of twins. I've got a boy and a girl, and I know that their sexual histories will diverge due to what their gender is and how they're treated.
Sophia Cannon and Professor Coker, thank you very much for joining me here on Global and talking about what is a very interesting new law. Thank you both for your time.